All right, so this is going to be a section of the overall Nixon lecture, and you're going to be looking at Nixon foreign policy in this video lecture. So we're going to talk first about the mess of Vietnam that Nixon inherits, really from LBJ, and I'm going to give you some context of what's going on to lead in. And so when Nixon gets elected in 1968, what has happened is since 1964, the United States has escalated the war. And so you'll hear about escalation versus Vietnamization. Escalation is typically the increase of the American presence. Vietnamization is typically seen as the gradual American withdrawal and handing the war effort over to the South Vietnamese. So when Nixon comes in 1968, he is in the kind of inheriting the situation at the height of escalation, and he wants to get out. He's kind of promised America when he gets elected what we call peace with honor. Like he wants to get America out of this situation, but he knows that America can't just leave. If he just leaves, then it's going to make us look really bad in the eyes of the international community. We've created this huge mess. We've stuck our nose in there. There's problems potentially in Laos and Cambodia that we've sort of created. And so Nixon is aware that he can't just pull American troops out. He's got to kind of finish the job in a way. And so he's got to do so and, make sure that the mess that America has created is kind of dealt with. And so he calls this whole program Peace with Honor. So at the height of American involvement, which is 1969, about a year into Nixon's first year in office, America has 542,000 combat troops in Vietnam. And so at the beginning of Nixon's time, we still have escalation going on. And then by 1970, 2 years in, we start to see kind of a receding, at least initially, a receding or a change in policy that we again call Vietnamization. Now, Vietnamization, there's kind of two parts to it. One is withdrawal of American troops, but the other part is we have to train the South Vietnamese. We have to give them armaments so that they can be able to defend themselves once we leave. Now, not only will that get America out of Vietnam, but it's also, again, contextually, you have to understand that this is the height of the New Left movement, of the anti-war protest. One of the major problems with the war so far is that if you are a college student or somebody like that, you are able to get a deferment. You're probably not going to have to go to combat. Whereas if you are a poor person, somebody that has just maybe even just barely a high school education, most likely you're going to be the one that has to go to the front lines and fight. And so this is causing a lot of protest, even though most of the people that are protesting are the ones that are getting deferments as part of the New Left on the university protest scene. So this Vietnamization is going to kind of quiet that down a little bit. All right. And so really from 69 to 70, you see this policy kind of being instituted. We start to see a gradual withdrawal. But then Nixon actually does something to kind of bring back the protest. And so let's talk about the bombings of Cambodia. Now, over here on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the map of Vietnam, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Now, where Khe Sanh is, which is kind of in the middle there, you have the 17th parallel. Now, the 17th parallel, really, for the most part, the United States had lockdown. The North Vietnamese weren't going to be able to get in to the area of South Vietnam through that. So what they did is they went through Laos and Cambodia and went through the rainforest where it was very hard to detect, and just went along this huge long border, through rainforest, through tunnel systems, whatever they had to avoid the American army. And it's very difficult for the American army to try to defend that long border, that western border of South Vietnam. It was very easy for the Viet Cong to get in. So initially, the public didn't know about this. Nixon was bombing Cambodia, which was highly illegal, but without congressional approval. But at that time, there were negotiations going on with North Vietnam. Now, the sticking point of the whole negotiations was that North Vietnam refused to get the Viet Cong, which are the North Vietnamese, out of South Vietnam. And so Nixon said, "Well, we're gonna keep bombing until that happens." And so, to that end, he encouraged a coup d'état in Cambodia that got rid of a government that was kind of anti-American and led to a pro-American government in Cambodia. That government gave us our approval to clean it out, to get out the bad people, so to speak. And so, in a way, they invited us to bomb their country to get out the Viet Cong and to get out the people that were aiding and abetting. And now this is going to create just an absolute disaster in Cambodia. And if you know a little bit of Cambodian history, because of this, we're going to see Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge come in, and they're going to massacre like a third of the entire Cambodian population. So Cambodia is kind of another story. But for us, once we see these series of bombings in Cambodia, almost immediately that revives the protest of the war along college campuses and in America in general. Now, combined to this, some other things are going to come out that's not going to help, Nixon's popularity of these bombings of Cambodia. So one of the protests that, was trying to demonstrate against the bombings of Cambodia was at Kent State in Ohio. And so the National Guard was kind of brought in to, disperse the protesters. Well, one thing happened, led to another. And before you know it, you have 5 people shot and killed, 5 students shot and killed. And you can see down in the bottom right-hand corner. And then 2 weeks later at Jackson State, 2 more people were killed. So, these are really a direct result of the protests brought about by the bombings of Cambodia. Now, in 1970, 1971, reports started coming out, and I think I mentioned this before in class, but if not, there was a village in South Vietnam that apparently was harboring Viet Cong, and because everybody was dressed in plain clothes, they didn't know who were the Viet Cong and who were just the South Vietnam villagers. And so this platoon of Americans basically just murdered the entire village of about 500 people. They burned the village. They killed men, women, and children. They raped women. I mean, it was really, really bad. And then eventually this story leaked and it got back to the press, and then the press leaked it, and it just made the government look really bad. Remember, we talked about the credibility gap, what the government was telling the American people, and then what reporters started reporting back. There was a difference between what the government was telling and what the reporters were telling. Add to this that reporters were starting to, disseminate information back to the United States media outlets about the behavior of some of the American troops, where they were getting hooked on drugs. They were going to brothels in Vietnam. They were, they did things like the My Lai massacre. There were reports of desertions where people got disgruntled with the war, and so they just left and, moved into Vietnam themselves or Cambodia, Laos, all kinds of bad things going on as a result of this. And so you're going to see Nixon from really this time. He's going to use the bombings and really focus on, we're going to see the Christmas bombing as an example, where Nixon's trying to bomb the living daylights out of North Vietnam and Cambodia to try to get North Vietnam to come back to the negotiating table so that they will get the Viet Cong out and, America can get out. But we can say that from 1969, where we have a height of American troops, gradually we are going to start withdrawing. So by 1973, 1974, there are virtually very few American troops that are left. All right, in an attempt to bring negotiations to a head during the month of December, they're kind of called the Christmas bombings, Nixon uses B-52s to go up and just absolutely bomb the living daylights out of Hanoi and Haiphong and the port areas around North Vietnam to try to get the North Vietnamese back to the negotiating table, which he does. However, by this time, the war is very unpopular. He is, using his policy of Vietnamization. He's really trying to get America out of the war. And so he makes kind of the fatal mistake, he along with Henry Kissinger. And let me just talk about the importance. I kind of forgot to talk about the importance of Henry Kissinger, but Nixon was definitely a president that tried to circumvent the normal ways that government was used. And so even though he had a Secretary of State that should have been handling a lot of these things and a Secretary of Defense, he really relied on this guy named Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger was kind of seen internationally as this kind of foreign policy savant, really good strategist, had good networks, good public speaker. And so Nixon relied on Henry Kissinger quite a bit in the handling of negotiations with Vietnam. And so Henry Kissinger in late 1972, early 1973, helped to engineer the Paris Peace Accords. And in the Paris Peace Accords, we agreed to, in the hostilities with North Vietnam, we agreed that they would be two different countries. We agreed that they would be separated at the 17th parallel. But the thing that Nixon had to give up was that the North Vietnamese never agreed to get the Viet Cong out of South Vietnam. And if you're going to criticize Nixon, this is one of the big things that you would criticize him about, because that led to just a level of instability in South Vietnam as we left. And then what we're going to see is that, really by 1975, the North Vietnamese, they invade again into South Vietnam. By this time, Nixon is out as president. They asked Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford asked Congress for permission to go back in and defend the South Vietnamese. Congress denies that approval. And so, North Vietnam, they end up taking over South Vietnam anyways. And so what was the purpose of the Vietnam War? The purpose of the Vietnam War was to stop the spread of communism. We didn't do that. So that would, we could say that the Vietnam War was really a failure. If you're going to kind of rank the worst wars for the United States, this has got to rank really either at the top or near the top. So let's kind of look at the fallout from that. We spent $150 billion on the war, which really just kills, I'm going to go down to the bottom there, just killed a great society. And remember that LBJ was trying to do what we call guns and butter. So he's trying to fight the war on poverty and then fight the war in Vietnam. And he couldn't do both. And Vietnam really ate up a lot of that money that should have gone to probably urban poverty and things like that. So that's a bad thing. Then in terms of the war itself, you have 50,007 Americans killed. You have 300,000 Americans wounded. Countless numbers of soldiers that had post-traumatic syndrome where they're just kind of messed up mentally after the war. Remember, we talked about there was a lot of sketchy things going on with drug use and things like that. So really, there's not a lot of positives that come out of Vietnam in the Vietnam War. And so if you want to say we lost this war, I think that's reasonably accurate. All right, some other foreign policy events of Nixon. This is where we kind of see the brilliance of Nixon and Henry Kissinger, where they understand that there's kind of a changing tone. There's a changing balance of power in the world, and they are really quick to recognize that. And so they formulate their version of containment, or their version of, the whatever you want to call it, the flexible response, the Truman Doctrine, containment. And it's kind of been called the Nixon Doctrine. Now, heart of the Nixon Doctrine is that they understand that by this time in 1972, really America and the Soviet Union is not as big of a rivalry as China and the Soviet Union. So Nixon hopes to kind of play off of that and to use that to the United States' advantage. And so to that end, he sends Henry Kissinger to China, and they start opening up negotiations. And one of the things that comes out of that is that we finally formally recognize China as a legitimate country. Now, since 1949, when Chiang Kai-shek bolted China and went over to Taiwan, we have been recognizing them as the Chinese government, and we basically just didn't acknowledge that China proper existed. In other words, they have the most people in the world, the largest country in the world in terms of population, and we didn't recognize them as a legitimate government. And so this is something that Nixon does that is brilliant. And it's really probably in the long run good for both China and the United States. So this really lays the groundwork to open trade up with China. And as probably most of you know, this is going to lead to a lot of outsourcing and American factories going over to China. China's going to become one of the leading producers of steel, of textiles, of the things that we used to produce. Now they're going to produce those, and we're going to take advantage of low labor costs. They are going to use us to create jobs and things like that. So really, probably, even though the governments may not admit it, this is really a good thing for both countries in the long run. So you can credit that for Nixon. The other one is Russia. Nixon also he's going to go to both China and Russia, and he's going to open up talks with Brezhnev. And really, a couple things come out of his meetings with the Soviets. And one of them is called SALT. So write this down, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And there's going to be a couple of these SALT treaties, but the idea of them is to slow down the arms race. Up until this point, we are just mass producing nuclear weapons, probably way more weapons than we'd ever need to blow the earth completely up. And what SALT does is it puts a freeze on that. So we couldn't make any more. He's like, you can have what you have, but we're not going to make any more. And then subsequent SALT treaties will start to reduce some of those amounts of nuclear weapons. But that's a pretty big thing. And so we kind of say that with the SALT treaty, with Nixon going to Russia and kind of normalizing relations with them a little bit, we actually even sell a bunch of wheat to them during the 1970s. This creates a period of what's called détente. And détente is just kind of an easing of the tension that we've had since the 1960s. Remember when we had the Bay of Pigs invasion, when we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so now things are at least going through a trough, like a down period of tension with the Soviets. All right, finally, some other foreign events for Nixon. One of the other things that the Nixon doctrine looked at was, what America needed to do in terms of dealing with third world countries. At this time, third world countries are starting to become a problem. They are very unstable economically. We want them to be trade partners, but they really don't have the finances to be able to buy our stuff. And really, they're not making anything that we would necessarily want to buy. And so we want to use these countries, like we're going to use China for factory labor and things like that. And so we definitely have an interest in them, and we want them to be stable because we don't want, communism spreading to other places. And so what we really try to do is we try to prop up governments that will be pro-U.S., that will be anti-Marxist, anti-communist. And so that's kind of what we do. All right. And a good example of this is Chile. In 1970, there was an election in Chile, a fair election, that brought a communist into power, a guy by the name of Allende. And we didn't like that. So we helped engineer a coup that brought in a more of a pro-U.S. government that then, would make favorable concessions to us in terms of buying land and investing in natural resources and things like that. And this guy that we installed, this Pinochet, he was a disaster. I mean, he was a dictator. He was ruthless to any kind of opposition, and we were sort of responsible for that. And so that is indicative of some of the things that's going to happen. We're going to have problems in El Salvador. We're going to have problems in Guatemala, and a lot of those are just us sticking our nose in, wanting to make sure that there are governments that are favorable to the U.S. Now, in terms of Latin America, if you ever wonder why the Latin American countries don't particularly like us, it's things like this. We, as far back as Panama, we've kind of been sticking our nose in there. And really, other than a brief period during Hoover and FDR, where we had this good neighbor policy, now we're kind of switching back over to a bad neighbor policy. And we also have trouble in the Middle East. In 1967, Israel is attacked by Jordan and Syria. They are, they are able to mount a counterattack, and they end up taking, land in the West Bank, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Peninsula. Now, they probably could have taken more, but the United States stepped in, and really in both cases, the Six-Day War, and then in 1973, the Yom Kippur War, to help make sure that, the Israelis didn't take over more and more land, which they probably could have. Now, why would we do that? Because really, Israel has been our ally since the 1940s. Why did we kind of stop them from taking more? And the answer is oil, right? By this time, we are not producing enough oil in America and we need Middle Eastern oil. To punish us for supporting Israel in this, the Arab countries, through what is called OPEC, the oil or petroleum exporting countries of the world, they have by this time created a cartel or a pool where they have set prices. And what they did is they just jacked up prices. So by 1973, 1974, the cost of oil has gone up. There's long waits at the gas stations, and it creates an energy crisis in the mid 1970s, which is one of those reasons why we start to have this major recession in the 70s. Remember, we said our economy was pretty good in the late 1950s, for the most part in the 60s. But then by the 70s, we are dealing with the problem of stagflation, where we have inflationary costs and rising unemployment, which you typically don't see together. And one of those reasons was because of our involvement in the Middle East on behalf of Israel, that's going to lead to retribution by the Arab countries. Okay, so that is where we're going to end for today with Nixon's foreign policy. And then in class, we will start going over the domestic stuff that happens during Nixon's time and hopefully get up through Ford and Carter. Thanks for tuning in.